Hi, good morning and good afternoon, everyone. This is Beth Galella from Bristol Myers Squibb, and I am a member of the IQ Pediatric Working Group. On behalf of the working group, I have the pleasure today of introducing Stuart Charlton. Stuart works at Bristol Myers Squibb in the Drug Product Development Group, having joined the company in 2005. His current role as Senior Principal Scientist is focused on the development of oral solid dosage forms from the preclinical stage through to product registration. Stuart has a particular interest in pediatric drug product development and is an SME supporting activities across the company. Other research interests include roller compaction and film mechanistic understanding and mini piloting. Stuart graduated from the University of Bath with a degree in pharmacy and was later awarded a PhD by the University of Nottingham in 2002. At the conclusion of this webinar, you will receive an email from Mahalea with a feedback survey. It is very important to the speakers as well as to us as moderators to ensure the quality and value of our webinar series. So we do appreciate your feedback. And with that, I will like to pass it over to Stuart.
Thanks, Beth. Thanks to Mahalea and to Beth for the introduction. And I'd also like to kick off with thanking IQ for inviting me to present today. So I'm Stuart Charlton, as Beth said. I'm a senior principal scientist at Bristol Myers Squibb in the drug product development section. And I'm going to speak today on a scientific and risk-based approach to pediatric formulations. So to kick things off, what does that mean? So some of you may have already spotted a key phrase in that title, and that is a scientific and risk-based approach. And that is very much a key philosophy of quality by design. So looking at the quality by design definition in ICH Q8, it's a systematic approach to development that begins with predefined objectives and emphasizes product and process understanding and process control based on sound science and quality risk management. So for this presentation, I am going to focus on some key aspects of that, particularly predefined objectives, risk management, product understanding, process understanding, and analytical considerations. But this isn't intended to be a QBD presentation. This is very much meant to be a pediatric presentation. So I'm going to be focusing absolutely on aspects of QBD and risk management with respect to pediatric development. So kicking things off with the first of those points, and that's predefined objectives. And the most important thing with defining your objectives up front is identifying a quality target product profile. This is really a key underpinning that should be identified early on in development and needs to be updated as a living document all the way through development. But this is something that a formulator or a scientist should be referring to make sure that a product is being developed that is right for the patient, hits all the drug product requirements, and is also right in terms of business needs as well. And with all of those different considerations and aspects, to be able to identify your TPP attributes, you really need to get input from all parts of the organization. And I've listed here particularly product development, clinical, regulatory, and commercial. And as I said, that needs to be not just from a business perspective, but also each of those groups need to understand the needs of the patient as well. So here's an example of a pediatric QTPP, which I have taken from the WHO toolkit. And there's quite a few different things here, ranging from, being patient-oriented, drug attributes, cost, manufacturing considerations, stability considerations. So I'm just going to break down into, a few of the real key elements, certainly that I look at as a formulator when helping me decide what sort of dosage form I want to be developing and what things I want to be thinking about, especially early on, but also as I go through the drug product development process. So patient population is absolutely key. Who is my patient? What condition do they have? Do they maybe have multiple indications for this drug product? What age range are they? Age range is especially important, will drive a lot of decisions over what dosage form is selected. And I'll go over that in more detail in the next few slides, along with a number of these. Administration considerations, including route. There's going to be a couple of variables, such as therapeutic and patient considerations, that will drive that. Safety and stability, extremely important. Critical attributes for your drug product. The dose, what's the dose range? What are the therapeutic index? This again is tying back into what are the patient needs and linking that in also with the attributes of your API and your drug product. Often dose is challenging because in the early stages of pediatric development, the dose for your pediatric patients is often not identified. Commonly the focus is 99% on the adult formulation, which in pharmaceutics almost always comes before the pediatric product. Not always, but certainly most of the time. So some predictions can be made on modeling based on knowledge from adult clinical studies, but certainly in my experience, knowing the dose tends to be a challenge in the very early stages. Though, as I get into some discussion of dosage form, certainly picking a dosage form that gives you flexibility can help you to handle that challenge more easily. And then palatability considerations. This is always a huge topic when it comes to pediatric products, ensuring that you have a product with good acceptability, of which palatability is arguably the key variable. And at the early stage, when you're devising your QTPP and trying to identify what dosage form is appropriate, do you have any information on the taste profile at that time? Have you done, for example, any early taste testing with just the API before you start looking at dosage forms? Have you maybe done some questionnaires and gathered some information from adult clinical studies that could inform you in designing your drug product? So it is extremely important that you select a dosage form that aligns with your target product profile. So I'll go through some of the drivers for dosage form selection, and this very much follows on from the previous slide that we had up. So patient population, that is typically driven by the lowest age in your target population. The lowest age in the target population will predominantly drive your drug product selection. And certainly the lowest age patients are the most challenging in what dosage forms are feasible and also what doses. And also it's not uncommon to need a different dosage form for patients under 6 months or 1 year, either driven by a need for a very low dose in that age group or because of administration challenges. There should also be consideration for suitability of the existing adult dosage form, especially for your adolescent patients. In many instances, sponsors are encouraged to include adolescent patients in the adult phase 2 and phase 3 studies with the aim of including adolescents on the original product approval. But certainly they need to be considered when developing your age-appropriate dosage form as well. Route of administration should primarily be driven by patient and therapeutic needs. Acceptability considerations are also very important. For example, product manipulation, such as dissolving a solid in water or milk and then having to syringe an accurate dose and then administer to a young child. those sorts of manipulations and factors can be challenging for a caregiver in terms of just the physical manipulation, but also ensuring accurate dosing. So that needs to be taken into consideration with your particular drug. Dosing devices may also be considered either as a convenience or to give the level of control that's needed for your particular drug product. And of course, safety is always a factor in drug product consideration and thinking of the patient. I've already mentioned manipulation, but also, especially with excipients, considering acceptable daily intake levels. Certainly, we consider toxicity concerns and doses of the active, but excipients also need to be considered, and what levels of excipients are being used and are they appropriate for your target population. So continuing on, the dose, what degree of dose flexibility is required? Certainly some dosage forms give more flexibility than others. Liquid, for example, offers extremely good dose flexibility by being able to alter the volume administered, but then liquid also comes with other challenges. Certain presentations are limited in their dose capacity. For example, chewable tablets typically 10 to 20% drug loading, but it can be higher. Certainly there are examples such as bendazole, which is a 400 milligram chewable tablet. Orodispersible films, typically you're looking at very low doses. An example that springs to mind is ondansetron, that's available in a 4 milligram and an 8 milligram film. So certainly not suitable for 100, 200 milligrams. Again, beadlets can only carry so much of a dose, though you have the option of increasing the volume, but the drug loading on those is typically low, and beadlets are particularly suitable for microgram doses. Extended dosage forms as well, if they're required, they will typically require a solid dosage form of some sort, even if it's administered as a suspension. So stability is extremely important. As I mentioned, liquids can present a number of challenges. Generally speaking, adding water into the mix always increases the stability challenge, but of course not insurmountable, as we all know, simply by the fact that there's so many liquid products on the market. But as I'll get into in a few slides, certainly in the industry presently, there seems to be a shift in preference. And then again, stability, excipient compatibility is extremely important. And it's certainly recommended that excipient compatibility studies are performed very early on in development to identify suitable excipients that are compatible with your active. Palatability is a major critical quality attribute for pediatric oral products. There are many formulation strategies for managing palatability, with most common being inclusion of flavors and sweeteners, or coating, either coating the API or the drug product to inhibit drug release so that it can't either be tasted, or at least the intensity of that taste is reduced. So something that I think is important when looking at dosage form selection is considering your strategy in the clinic, and especially considering pediatric versus adult dosage forms. So you've got multiple options that you can adopt here. For example, you might choose to use a fit for purpose formulation to get to phase 1 quickly, or potentially to support an early PK study that can be critical for estimating doses for different age groups. However, that does create extra work when changing the formulation and moving to a suitable for commercialization product. That may require a bridging study, for example, to bridge between the two formulations, or a BE study. Often companies choose to develop a close to commercial formulation for all studies, and by doing that, all data, even from early studies, can support the filed presentation, which can be significant when patient recruitment is challenging and you want all of your studies to, reflect that product that is going into the final filing. And certainly recruitment and the number of studies needed often play a big part in the overall timeline of taking a pediatric product from initial development through to registrational filing. Consideration also needs to be given to your adolescent patients. Do you want to only use your age-appropriate drug product for your adolescent patients? And if you go all the way down to, say, 3 months of age, then you could, for example, have a sprinkle that should be mixed with food. Do we anticipate there might be poor adherence for a 16-year-old that needs to take that? Alternatively, you might want to drive, ideally, to have adolescents included in the adult label, and certainly recruiting adolescent patients into adult phase 2 and phase 3 studies can get you that and can give you huge benefit in terms of label flexibility, but also getting early data in pediatric patients, which can improve accuracy of dose modeling in the younger age groups under 12. So moving on to risk management. Risk assessments are key. They are very important to be conducted so that you can understand and manage the risks all the way through the development process. And they should be conducted from very early development, I would say, before you even get into full development of your first formulation, and should also continue right the way through to scale up and get into commercial batch manufacture. As you go through the process, the type of risk assessments that you conduct will vary. And at the start, you'll probably have simpler qualitative type risk assessments, whereas later on, you'll have much more detailed risk assessments, such as an FMEA analysis. When doing the risk assessment, you very much need to have your quality target product profile to hand to ensure that you are looking at aspects and developing your drug product that meets the target that you're working to. And you should consider all formulation components, API, excipients, critical quality attributes, performance and stability risks, and also patient safety. Consider the manufacturing process and also look at packaging, both materials and the process. Through the risk assessment process, you should be able to identify your potential critical quality attributes in the early stages, and certainly the critical process parameters, and certainly later on, they're key for focusing development work, and also important as you start scaling up and moving to commercial scale. So I've given an example here of a very early stage risk assessment, which is taking into consideration drug product attributes and formulation components. And you can see that this is a qualitative example, just using high, medium, and low to characterize risks. And this would be typical for either an adult or a pediatric dosage form. There's a couple of things in here that might be more typical to a pediatric dosage forms. For example, we've got sucrose as a sweetener here. That, for example, might bring some risk around impurities and degradants, especially if exposed to higher temperatures and humidities. Certainly important as far as taste is concerned. Flavor, which is less commonly used in adult products, but more commonly in pediatrics. That's obviously critical as what you select and what level you select with regard to taste. From personal experience, I've also found that flavors can cause impurity and degradant and stability challenges, being often complex mixtures of components. The film coat might be important either just for appearance, but if you're using a functional film coat to mitigate taste, then obviously that becomes a much more important factor in the taste attribute. Packaging as well, that could well be key in terms of product manipulation. We also talked about manipulation factors with pediatrics. A key parameter in packaging consideration for pediatrics as well is patient safety. and making sure something is child resistant, but you also don't want to make it too difficult for carers to get into. So we've got a number of factors there that are typical of any risk assessment, but a few that are more common in pediatrics. Okay, so common oral dosage forms for pediatrics that might be considered. Liquid, which has been prevalent for many years and the go-to for a long time. That can come in a ready-to-use solution or suspension, or it can be presented as a powder for reconstitution, typically reconstituted by a pharmacist before giving to patients, though not always. In some countries, those products would be given to patients for the carer to reconstitute. So another variable for scientists to consider when looking at suitability of a dosage form. Oral powders, granules, and multiparticulates, typically mixed with food or drink for administration, though some can be taken directly by pouring straight into the mouth and then chased down with a drink. And they're typically packaged in sachets or in a sprinkle capsule that's opened up to sprinkle onto food or drink. And then we have tablets that come in various different guises for pediatrics. Mini tablets, which is very much becoming a popular selection of late. Chewable tablets, soluble tablets, or a dispersible tablet or films. One thing to highlight here when I was putting this slide together was consideration of mini tablets. Should they be considered as tablets or should they be considered as granules? Certainly with the FDA guidance that came out in 2012, which basically says that any multi-particulate below 2.5 millimeters can be considered as a sprinkle. Then certainly I find with development of mini tablets with regard to considering patient acceptance and a number of other factors, such as how we look at them in filings and from analytical perspectives, it's often better to consider them and present them as an oral granule rather than as a tablet. So is liquid the gold standard? Liquid certainly offers excellent dose flexibility when it's in the hands of the patient. It's generally easy to swallow. Some taste good. This example is Calpol, which is a paracetamol, acetaminophen, trying to remember the US name. In the UK, this is certainly a golden standard. I've never come across a child that doesn't like this, including my 3 children. There's certainly, I know, some formulations of paracetamol that really don't taste good, and especially a number of antibiotics that are extremely poor tasting. So liquids have their positives, but certainly have their negatives in some instances. So going through some of the aspects of liquids, microbial growth, as we mentioned earlier, having water there always presents a microbial instability risk. From our risk perspective, we've got a product quality risk here, and also preservatives can be used to counter that, but use of which preservative and levels needs to be considered in pediatric patients and can present a patient risk. They're certainly heavy and bulky to transport compared to solid dosage forms, which certainly presents a business risk. Drug solubility or suspension uniformity may be a challenge, another product quality risk, and potentially a patient risk if you need to use solubilizing agents to achieve the formulation that you want. Those products that are very high in sugar certainly present a dental risk to patients. And there's also evidence in patients with chronic conditions that patient adherence isn't good with very sweet and syrupy products over a very long period. And often even very young patients have a preference to move over to solid dosage forms. And also medication errors are common. There's certainly a number of papers, I've quoted just one, for example, here, that shows a lot of variation in carers being able to accurately draw up the correct dose using oral syringes. So that certainly presents an additional patient risk. So are mini tablets the new gold standard? Certainly at conferences and in meetings, mini tablets have dominated the discussion. There's a large proportion of papers coming out on the positives of mini tablets for pediatrics. So for that reason, I'm going to dedicate the next few slides to looking at mini tablets. So they are being widely adopted across the industry, certainly talking to colleagues in other companies, at IQ meetings, EUPFI discussions and conferences. Mini tablets are very much at the front of discussions. They have many favorable product attributes and arguably have a lower risk profile. They avoid most of the issues associated with liquids, and they can be easily coated for taste masking. And they also offer high dose flexibility during development. I think it's important to identify the difference potentially between flexibility for the patient versus during development. So I mentioned earlier on that one of the challenges in development is knowing what dose to be developing for your different age groups. And certainly if you have a larger dosage form, you need to know exactly what dose you're aiming for. Whereas with mini tablets, you can focus on manufacturing your mini tablet formulation. Typically, a single 2 millimeter diameter mini tablet will be about 8 milligrams in weight, and that will give you, for example, maybe a 0.5 milligram drug loading in that. So to achieve then the clinical dose that you need, you just give multiple mini tablets, and that gives you huge flexibility. Once you get to the patient end, this would typically be presented as a fixed dose in a sachet, or this example given here, a stick pack. So that flexibility isn't available once in the patient or the caregiver's hands, but it certainly is from an industry perspective through clinical studies, and also in terms of commercial manufacturability, where you can then just diversify at the packaging stage. A huge advantage of mini tablets is that you can leverage prior experience from your work developing an adult product, and in many cases you can simply take the adult formulation and use that to manufacture mini tablets with little or no modification to the formulation. They're typically mixed with food and drink for administration, and as I've already mentioned, packaging typically in a sachet or in a sprinkle capsule, but dosing devices are starting to come to the fore, and they are a means of giving dose flexibility at the patient end of the chain, which can be critical for some drug products. So mini tablet attributes and risks. Tablets typically range from typically around 1.5 to just over 2 millimeters. But looking in literature, certainly the term mini tablet has been attributed to tablets ranging from 1 to 4 millimeters in diameter. Certainly from my perspective, I like to look to the FDA guidance that considers mini tablets as sprinkles if below 2.5. So certainly I would recommend that you always operate below that 2.5 millimeter diameter. 2 millimeter appears to be the most common at present, certainly looking at literature and from personal experience, and that gives a good balance between not making mini tablets too small that you have additional manufacturing challenges, but also trying to keep them small enough to get good patient acceptability, and also well under that FDA recommendation of 2.5 millimeters. In terms of patient acceptability, I've quoted a couple of papers here from the same group that have been doing extensive acceptability studies in pediatric patients, and they've shown that a single 2 millimeter mini tablet has been successfully administered to neonates, and also up to 400 mini tablets in children aged 2 to 6 years. I think generally, acceptability of high numbers of mini tablets in general raise some questions, and also dose into those very young age groups. But certainly, the literature that is being published shows that mini tablets have versatility and application across the full age range and over quite a wide dose range. And in terms of product acceptability, there's a number of products that are already on the market and are being used and accepted by patients, which to me is a strong indicator that the mini tablets are certainly a viable option. Just looking at some additional considerations and quality risks, content uniformity is certainly a key risk in mini tablet manufacture, and both API and granule size can impact content uniformity. For example, inclusion or exclusion of a single large granule in a very small single mini tablet might result in significant weight variation. Typically, as the number of mini tablets for a single dose increases, however, that variation in single mini tablets becomes less important or less significant as that higher tablet count averages out single count content uniformity deviations. Tooling for smaller diameter tablets is also more prone to failure and prone to tooling fatigue and damage, and that's certainly one of the limiting factors for how small you typically want to go with your mini tablet diameter. One approach that can be quite useful for reducing this risk is to use counterbore tooling, and I've put together this simple graphic to show the difference for those that aren't familiar. And you can see with the counterbore tooling, the tooling stems are significantly shorter and the barrel is significantly longer. The stem, which is your narrow part at the top, is obviously the weakest part of your tooling. So by being able to reduce the length of that stem, that certainly makes the overall tooling stronger. And to compensate for that shortening in the stem, you can see that the tooling inserts into the die to be able to have this difference in design. Another risk to be considered with mini tablets is that they can be prone to static charge, and that can certainly make handling and packaging processes more challenging. And also in terms of packaging, especially with low tablet counts, accuracy of packaging can be extremely important. For example, if your dose is only 4 mini tablets and you can only package a sachet to plus or minus 1 accuracy, then you can see immediately you're at risk of being 25% out on your target dose, which would obviously have a big impact on a patient. But before you even get there, that would certainly pass any release testing limits that would be in place. So moving on to taste challenges and risks. Many APIs present unpleasant flavor profiles, with bitterness definitely being the most common in my experience, and all the way down to neonates. Children typically have a negative response to bitterness. There are several approaches to evaluate taste, including getting feedback during clinical studies, either early adult studies or in your actual pediatric studies. And it's very useful not just using questionnaires, but to also record observations by people in the clinic. Certainly a lot can be taken from facial responses from the patients with regard to how your drug product is being accepted. You can do dedicated taste studies, for example, using trained panels or recruiting adult volunteers. E-tongue can be adopted, and also rodent brief access taste aversion, the BATA test, can be adopted for getting understanding of API and drug product taste profiles. I think it's also important to evaluate taste with food if appropriate. Sometimes you might find that dosing with foods can overcome a bad taste, but equally you don't want to have a bad combination that can taste even worse. And certainly when it comes to filing and your patient label, it's recommended to state a selection of foods that are suitable for your drug product that patients can mix with. Formulation options to mitigate poor taste include inclusion of sweeteners or flavors. You could do complexation, for example, ion exchange resins, binding cyclodextrins to try and mitigate release of the drug early on and in the mouth. Coating of products, which mini tablets is particularly good for, also granules. You could put a pH dependent film coat on there, for example, so that the drug is not released in the mouth, but is then quickly released in the stomach. You could use an ethyl cellulose, which is pH independent, or you could use lipid coatings either on API or on your dosage form. Another alternative is to include excipients in your formulation, such as bitter receptor antagonists. That's just a selection of options, but it's certainly not exhaustive. So administration with food or drink, certainly for mini tablets, sprinkles, powders, granules, they're typically mixed with food or drink for administration. Certainly consider if your product should disintegrate or dissolve in food or liquid, and that's certainly a factor for mouthfeel and for palatability. Sometimes it might be good to dissolve your solid dosage form so that it's easier for certainly very young patients to be able to swallow. But if you've got a bad tasting drug, you probably don't want it to dissolve, because then that full taste will be tasted by the patient. Certainly, it's typical to wean children on semi-solid foods from 6 months of age onwards. So if your target patient population is 6 months and older, then focus on dosing with foods. For those younger patients below 6 months, certainly consideration needs to be given for administration with water or milk or with formula. Certainly, stability of your drug product when mixed with foods needs to be investigated. pH of your food drink is certainly very important, especially if you've got a functional coating that can be impacted. But also, obviously, API stability can very much be impacted by the pH of the environment. So assessing that drug product compatibility with food drink, the FDA issued a draft guidance document in 2018, giving recommendations of expectations and how to go about evaluating drug product stability in food and drink. A key message that is in that guidance is that mixing with food or drink should have no appreciable effect on drug product stability or performance. As a scientist, you should certainly focus on your drug product critical quality attributes, and those would typically be your chemical stability, physical stability, and dissolution performance. The FDA recommends assessment of drug product mixed with food over a 2-hour period. So that would certainly also involve taking samples at intervals up to 2 hours. And from that, you should be able to determine what a safe, from a drug product stability and performance perspective, what a safe hold time is. And that will then drive your direction to patients and in the clinic during studies as to whether or not drug product can be mixed with food and then must be administered immediately, or whether it needs to be administered within 20 minutes, or whether it can be, safe for multiple hours. As well as chemical stability and dissolution, you need to look at one, not having an appreciable effect in terms of your regulatory limits for release, in terms of ensuring you have, for example, 80% dissolution in 30 minutes. But also, if you have a pH dependent film coat, you need to ensure that you also have retardation of drug release over that time period that it's held in food as well. Obviously, you need to think about pharmacokinetics, but you don't want to mix your coated product in a food that's going to have very quick drug release into the food, which will then mean that you don't have any taste masking. And Certainly one of the common go-tos when it comes to film coating is reverse enteric film coats, which dissolve below pH 5. However, if you look on the table here, which is in the FDA guidance, you can see a lot of common foods that are used for mixing drug products in pediatrics does have pH around about 5 or below. So that's definitely something to consider, and may well drive down your target hold time between mixing with food and how quickly that has to be administered. So excipient safety, I've already mentioned earlier on. This is certainly a key consideration. It needs to be looked at when selecting excipients. And one critical attribute to look at is the acceptable daily intake levels for your excipients, and examples that are extremely critical in this regard are sweeteners, solubilizing agents, preservatives, flavors, and dyes. So places to look for this, typically companies do not try and establish new limits for their excipients and typically look to historical data, and good places to look to get indications as to what is acceptable is the FDA Inactive Ingredients Database, the IID, and that provides excipient levels in approved products. But there's certainly some limitations to that information. It lacks key details such as how many dosage forms are administered in a day. It certainly doesn't identify pediatric dosage forms. It doesn't tell you what that particular product is in the database or what indication it's been used for. So it can be used as a guide, but on its own, it may not be enough to help you decide what levels to select for your excipients in your dosage form. An alternative database that you should look at is the STEP database, which is hosted on the EU PFI website. And that compiles safety and toxicity data of excipients used in clinical and non-clinical studies in relation to pediatric drug development. So that will not straight up say this is the level that you should use, but it gives you references and pulls together relevant literature that a scientist can look through and help to identify appropriate levels for excipients. I would also recommend to consider the possibility of future ADI revisions and don't formulate right at the ADI limit. Certainly, products such as sweeteners and sugars have had their ADI revised over the years, and I'm aware of 3 products at least that have had to be reformulated following a change in allowable dosage levels of excipients. So that should be factored in as part of your risk assessment and risk management in your drug product design and development. So just some final thoughts. Principles of quality by design should be applied to both adult and pediatric drug product development. Pediatric patients typically present greater challenges than adults with respect to acceptability, dose accuracy and flexibility, and excipient suitability and safety. Certainly keeping those things in mind with your quality target product profile and conducting risk assessments throughout development will help keep you on track and to avoid any unexpected surprises later on in your development process. Okay. So I want to thank everyone for taking the time to listen, and we've got about 15 minutes to open up for questions. Beth, are you there? Or are you handling questions?
Yes, I am. I wasn't sure if Mahalia was going to speak. Okay. Yes, our first question. For adult and pediatric dosage forms, is there a difference in selection of flavors?
think probably the first thing that comes to mind is there aren't that many adult products that use flavors. Certainly, though, there are going to be adult products, potentially chewable tablets, more likely in syrups. Taste preferences of pediatrics and adults definitely have some variation. And equally, there are variation in preferences and flavors across geographical regions. And I would say typically it's good to go for safe flavors such as orange, strawberry, that are well received in both adults and pediatrics. I think there's probably some additional flavors that might be more suitable in pediatrics. Certainly in the US, bubblegum flavor is very popular. I don't know how popular that is in adults. But I think one thing I would certainly stress is looking at geographical preferences. Preferred flavors in US versus Europe versus the Middle East definitely have variation.
Okay, thank you, Stuart. Okay, what testing? Oh, no, I'm sorry. Actually, that question was answered already. Okay, for content uniformity and dissolution testing of mini tablets, do you recommend considering single mini tablet when the dose is not determined at early stage of development?
For dissolution testing?
For content uniformity and dissolution of mini tablets.
So certainly for content uniformity, the golden standard would be to conduct content uniformity testing on single mini tablets. If you are at a stage where you can assure content uniformity for a single mini tablet, then that gives you the assurance for any dose, any greater dose, you should also have content uniformity, because as you increase the number of mini tablets, the content uniformity challenge, as it were, becomes smaller. In terms of dissolution testing, I would say dissolution testing becomes more challenging as the dose increases, because you obviously approach your solubility limit. So if you were going to look at, for example, an analytical strategy that gives you the most flexibility and looks for a matrixing type approach, you should try and establish content uniformity at 1 mini tablet, or at least at the lowest clinical dose, and dissolution testing at the highest dose. If you're at a very early stage where you have no idea of the dose, then it becomes very challenging to say what is your highest dose for dissolution testing. So if you have no idea at all, then certainly test at 1 mini tablet. Certainly I've worked on a project where we've done dissolution testing on 1 mini tablet. But as soon as you start identifying your doses, I definitely recommend for dissolution testing that you increase to testing at the highest dose that has been identified at that time for going into your first or next round of clinical studies, for example.
Okay, thank you. Is there a correlation between e-tongue and trained panel study?
Oh, so probably my first I can't really answer that is the short one. I don't have personal experience of e-tongue. I've certainly read a number of papers. I think you will be able to find examples where e-tongue correlates with patient experience. Generally speaking, I would say, in my personal opinion, that e-tongue has its strength in being able to rate, for example, a series of formulations to know what has stronger intensities between, say, formulation A, B, and C. And certainly if you have references that you can insert into there and you understand from patient experience how those references are are received by patients, are perceived by patients, then you may well be able to make a correlation between e-tongue and patient experience. But I think that is certainly the biggest challenge and one of the biggest reservations that many have around e-tongue. I don't want to say that it doesn't have a place in development. It certainly does, and there's many proponents of e-tongue, but that is certainly one of the biggest challenges.
Okay. Mini tablets seem like a great pediatric dosing option, especially for drugs which can be administered as a flat dose. However, how can they offer flexibility when BSA-based or BW-based dosing is needed?
When which, sorry, so varying for body weight, is that?
Body weight, I'm sure. BSA,
Body surface area? Okay, so when you're at the clinical stage, you can have, you think how, so you need to, there's different stages where you can consider the flexibility given by mini tablets. Certainly for me as a formulator, the biggest flexibility I have is that I can start developing them before I know what doses are needed in the clinic. And I can then very quickly and easily present to the clinic different doses by varying the amount of mini tablets that are presented. Now, once you get to a patient or a final product, you arguably have some limitations on that flexibility, but I would say that can be overcome by considering how you present your dosage form, and that's where dosing devices come into play. You certainly don't want to be providing bulk or a sachet for a caregiver to pour out and count. Mini tablets are extremely difficult to handle, and it's not at all acceptable to have patients counting out mini tablets. However, there are, I can think off the top of my head, probably about 5 dispensing devices that are well into their late development, that you can dial into that how many mini tablets you want to dispense, and that can range from, you know, dispensing between 1, 2, 3 all the way up to, you know, over 100. And using that sort of device by dialing in the amount that you want, which it then dispenses out into you know, your pot of yogurt or your pot of applesauce, then that can give you flexibility at the patient or, you know, in the hospital environment.
Okay, thanks. In addition to compatibility with food or drink, do you need to show bioequivalence of the product mixed with food or taken as is?
So with the guidance right now in terms of the what I showed here, that is not part of the consideration, the experiments in the FDA guidance that was released 2 years ago for mixing with food and drink. But taking a step back from that and looking at overall considerations that would be done for any drug product, then the impact of food and you know, difference in PK in a fed or fasted state needs to be typically considered in any drug product filing and development, not just in pediatrics. I think an extra factor there is also to consider as well, what is your target age range, and looking at your different ages and considering what does the fed state look like. In very young patients, are they ever in a fasted state? So that's something to consider as you're, you know, going about your clinical study design and thinking about what needs to be investigated and what needs to go into your regulatory submission.
Okay, I'm going to try and get through a couple more questions. Do you have any experience using facial expression to assess taste acceptability? If so, can you provide more details on how that is done and who is the best observer? For example, site personnel or parent.
Yeah, so I don't have personal in-clinic experience. I've spoken to a number of colleagues that do. Certainly, I know a number of people in the EU PFI that are doing this work. I would say rather than a parent, an on-site personnel at the studies are the best people to do this. Certainly, it gives more consistency, and you can also give training. And the times that you want to be gathering this data is typically during your studies, either early clinical studies or specifically looking at palatability as part of a PK study, for example. This is particularly powerful in younger children where either you've got children below 1 year of age that can't speak at all, or even with children up to the age of 3, 4 that may not be able to vocalize what they're feeling, but certainly facial expressions tend not to hide what they're feeling. And there's a number of papers out there that relate to things like pursed lips, lip curling, looking at the patient's eyes, being able to tell whether or not they, at least at the basic level, like or dislike a product, and that can at least give you, gross indications of acceptability. Arguably, it might not give you the level of granularity that a questionnaire might, but certainly in those younger age groups, I think observations are critical.
Okay. Well, I'm going to, before I pass it back over to Mahalea, I just want to say thank you very much, Stuart, for a very informative and insightful presentation, and for sharing your experience and answering these questions. There are a number of questions left, so I think we have recorded them and we'll share them with Stuart, and we can get the rest of your questions answered. So I'll pass it on to Mahalea now to close out the webinar.
Thanks very much. And thanks, Stuart, for a great presentation. We've got a lot of interest. As Beth said, we do have a lot of questions yet to answer, so we'll share those with you and hopefully be able to get you to give your perspective on those questions. Thanks once again to everyone for joining us today for the webinar. We have a number of webinars left for the year, and we'll be circulating those to the audience. If you have any interest, go ahead and register for them. And with that, we'll go ahead and close up. Thanks very much for attending, and have a great day.